Vietnam is a country located in Southeast Asia. Before we tell you about the Vietnam War, let us first give you a quick overview of what happened prior to the war. Before 1940, the French had control over Vietnam. However, starting in 1940 and throughout World War II, Japan was in control of Vietnam. When Japan was defeated by the U.S. in 1945, Vietnam declared itself an independent nation, but were still fighting the French to keep their independence. Then the Cold War comes along, and Russia, with China, support the Vietnamese because they are communists, while the US and Britain support the French to stop the spread of communism. In 1954, France finally left Vietnam, but the country was split into two separate countries at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was communist, and South Vietnam was democratic. The communists and the anti-communists were still at each other's throats. And this is why the Vietnam War finally starts on November 1st, 1955. The 35th U.S. President, John F. Kennedy, was embarrassed with the spread of communism and believed Vietnam was where he could finally make a strong stand, so he invested a lot into the war. He spent around $168 billion, which would now be worth just under $1.5 trillion, and sent over 2.7 million troops to fight alongside the local South Vietnamese, Australians, New Zealanders, Thailanders, and Filipinos. The North was aided by the Soviet Union, China, and South Korea. In total, over 9 million people fought in the war. Ready, soldier? Yeah, rush! The Vietnam War was a long, bloody war, killing around 1.4 million soldiers. 2 million civilians also suffered a tragic death. The war lasted 21 years, on top of centuries of prior conflict. Overall, the fighting in Vietnam was brutal and scarred soldiers for life. The Vietnamese practice unusual war tactics. They would do things such as dig tunnels to get behind enemy lines.
Dude, the enemy up there, can you see them?
I think they're up there.
They fled pretty far.
I know. Oh no!
These war tactics used by the North Vietnamese are known as guerrilla warfare tactics, and the U.S. troops, used to a much more formal style of fighting, struggled greatly. This style of warfare is
using small and stealthy units to surprisingly attack the opponent. The Vietnamese soldiers usually blended in with the peasants, wearing the same clothes and acting the same way. These tactics made American soldiers extremely hard to identify who was the enemy. When American troops were unaware, they were surprisingly ambushed. Besides, the Vietnamese soldiers also set up booby traps, landmines, and they planted bombs in towns which could kill American troops anywhere they went. This left a very heavy psychological burden on all the American soldiers. The Vietnamese followed the example of the Chinese guerrilla warfare. This has given them the highest priority to create safe base areas. The bases, usually located in swamps and forests, were easy to hide in. Since it was more difficult to do in places near cities or towns, the Vietnamese solved this problem by constructing an enormous system of underground tunnels. Those tunnel systems were usually located under some underground towns where communist soldiers could get all necessary supplies and even medical care. By using those tunnels, the Viet Cong forces could move from place to place and remain undetected by the U.S. Army.
The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong used many different tactics to kill the Americans. One of these tactics was booby traps. Some of these booby traps included snake pits, which were large pits filled with snakes that would kill the Americans. Another one was punji sticks. These are traps made with large bamboo stakes that were smeared with certain substances that could cause infections to the victim or even kill them. The USA used a bomb called napalm, which resulted in a flammable sticky chemical which was very deadly and caused the burning of forest, which would help the South Vietnamese and the Americans to spot out the North Vietnamese in the jungles.
This was deadly because the bomb carried something known as Agent Orange, which caused cancer and killed millions of people once they returned back from the Vietnam War.
Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States and started moving troops out of Vietnam because the war seemed to be lost. The U.S. officially pulled out of the war in 1973 after the Pacific Peace Conference was signed. And from there on, American troops were removed from South Vietnam and the draft stopped. With no support from the U.S., South Vietnam quickly crumbled under the North Vietnam attacks on Saigon. The war officially ended on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnam took over South Vietnam's capital, Saigon.